When a wealthy mother changes her will, her entitled children are left with nothing but a rundown farm and a horse. But what they discover hidden in the land will test their character, their loyalty, and their bond as siblings. Before we dive into this captivating story, let us know where you're watching from and don't forget to hit subscribe. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and lavender, Margaret Calloway's signature scent. The grand sitting room of her estate, with its towering bookcases and floor-to-ceiling windows, seemed an odd setting for what was about to unfold. Margaret sat poised in her favorite high-back chair, her posture straight despite her advancing years. The morning sun streamed through the window behind her, casting a regal glow around her silver hair. Christina Calloway arrived first, dressed impeccably in a tailored gray suit. Her sharp heels clicked against the marble floor, echoing her determination. She was every bit the corporate powerhouse she had worked hard to become, with not a hair out of place and a perpetual air of impatience. "Mother," Christina greeted curtly, setting her handbag on the chair beside her. Margaret nodded, her eyes calm but unreadable. "Have a seat, Christina. Peter should be here any moment." As if on cue, Peter Calloway strolled in, clearly less concerned about punctuality or appearances. His tousled hair and rumpled plaid shirt suggested he'd come straight from his latest hobby, probably rock climbing or surfing. Peter's laid-back demeanor often clashed with his sister's unyielding ambition, a fact Margaret knew well. "This better be important," Peter said, dropping into a chair. "I had plans today." Christina rolled her eyes. "Plans? Is that what you call your endless vacations?" "Enough," Margaret interrupted, her voice firm but kind. "I've called you both here because it's time we had an honest conversation about the future." The siblings exchanged wary glances. Margaret's wealth was no secret. As the widow of Edward Calloway, a successful entrepreneur, she had managed his estate and investments with remarkable acumen. Both Christina and Peter had long assumed they would inherit significant portions of that wealth. Margaret reached for a thick envelope resting on the table beside her. She handed it to her attorney, Mr. Harris, a wiry man with a penchant for precision. Clearing his throat, he began to read. According to the amended terms of Margaret Calloway's last will and testament, the primary beneficiaries, Christina Calloway and Peter Calloway, shall inherit the following: the Calloway farm located on Pine Hollow Road, and the horse currently residing there, named Shadow. Peter blinked, leaning forward as if he hadn't heard correctly. "Wait, what?" Christina's jaw tightened. "You're joking," she said, her voice icy. Mr. Harris continued, unfazed. "The remainder of the estate, including liquid assets, properties, and investments, will be transferred to a trust managed by the Calloway Foundation." "The Calloway Foundation?" Christina cut in, her voice rising. "What foundation? You're giving away everything to strangers?" Margaret met her daughter's gaze steadily. "It's not to strangers. It's to those who need it most." Peter leaned back in his chair, letting out a low whistle. "This is unexpected." "Unexpected?" Christina snapped. "It's outrageous. Mother, you can't be serious. We're your children. We've worked." "You've worked for yourselves," Margaret interrupted, her voice calm but resolute. "You've both had every opportunity in life, every advantage. But what have you given back? To anyone? To each other?" The room fell silent. Margaret stood, moving to the window. She looked out at the sprawling estate she had called home for decades, her expression wistful. "Your father and I built this for you. But somewhere along the way I realized I wasn't building a legacy, I was building a gilded cage. You've forgotten what it means to work for something, to appreciate the small things. That's why I've made this decision." Christina's face turned red. "You're punishing us. That's what this is. Some kind of moral lesson?" "No," Margaret said softly, turning back to face them. "It's a chance to grow. To learn." Peter, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. "Okay, but a farm? What are we supposed to do with that? I've barely even seen a cow, let alone run a farm." "There are no cows, Peter," Margaret said with the faintest hint of a smile. "Just Shadow and the land. But you'll figure it out. Together." Christina scoffed. "This is ridiculous. I'll challenge the will. I have lawyers, good ones. They'll make this go away." "You're free to try," Margaret replied evenly. "But I'd advise you to think carefully before you waste your energy fighting a gift." "A gift?" Christina's laugh was bitter. "A broken-down farm and a horse? That's your idea of a gift?" Margaret returned to her chair, her expression serene but firm. "It's more than you think." Peter rubbed the back of his neck. "Look, Mom, I get what you're trying to do. Teach us some kind of lesson about hard work and humility. But I don't know if Christina and I can do this. We're not exactly the teamwork type. You'll manage, Margaret said. I believe in you both more than you realize. Christina stood abruptly, grabbing her bag. Well, you can believe all you want. I'm not wasting my time playing farmer. Peter hesitated but rose as well. I guess we'll talk later, he said awkwardly, avoiding his mother's eyes. As the siblings left, the tension hung heavy in the air. Margaret remained seated, watching the door close behind them. Her fingers absently brushed the arm of her chair as she gazed out the window once more. Shadow, the black horse grazing in the distance, raised his head, almost as if sensing her gaze. Margaret smiled faintly. They'll understand someday, she murmured to herself. I hope. The dirt road stretched endlessly under the midday sun, dust clinging stubbornly to the sleek black sedan that crept along it. Christina tapped her manicured nails against the armrest, glaring out the window as the countryside unfurled around them. Fields of tall grass and rusting fences were a far cry from the polished urban landscape she was used to. I can't believe we're actually doing this, she muttered. Peter at the wheel let out a short laugh. Yeah, because staying in the city and pretending this didn't happen would have worked so well. Christina rolled her eyes. This place is worthless. Once we have it appraised, we sell it and move on. And Shadow? Peter asked, glancing at her. What's your plan for him? I don't care. Someone will take the horse. There's always someone who wants a horse, right? Peter sighed but said nothing, focusing on the road. A few more minutes of awkward silence passed before the farmhouse came into view. The structure was modest and weathered, its white paint peeling and shutters hanging askew. A large oak tree cast dappled shadows over the porch, where a lone figure stood. As they pulled up, the woman on the porch crossed her arms and squinted at them, clearly unimpressed. Great, Christina said under her breath. A welcoming committee? Peter parked and stepped out first, offering a friendly wave. Hi there. You must be? Emily Harper, the woman said, her tone clipped. She looked to be in her late 20s, with sun-kissed skin and hair tied back in a loose ponytail. Her work boots and jeans were scuffed, and her no-nonsense demeanor matched her attire. I'm the caretaker here. Have been for 5 years. Christina emerged from the car, her heels sinking slightly into the dirt. She wrinkled her nose and approached Emily with the forced smile of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. I'm Christina Calloway. This is my brother, Peter. I know who you are, Emily replied, her gaze flicking between them. Your mother told me you'd be coming. Peter stepped forward, extending his hand. Emily hesitated but eventually shook it. Thanks for taking care of the place, he said. She shrugged. Someone had to. Christina didn't bother with pleasantries. Let's get this over with. We need to see the house, the land, and, I suppose, the horse. Emily's lips pressed into a thin line. Shadow's in the pasture. I'll take you to him after you've seen the house. The siblings followed Emily into the farmhouse, where the air smelled faintly of wood and lavender, just like their mother's sitting room. The interior was sparse but clean, with mismatched furniture and faded curtains framing the windows. Christina glanced around with thinly veiled disdain. This place is quaint, she said. Peter chuckled. That's one way to put it. Emily ignored them, leading the way through the kitchen and out the back door. Beyond the yard, a wide expanse of green rolled into the horizon, dotted with wildflowers and bordered by dense woods. There's the pasture, Emily said, pointing. And there's Shadow. The horse stood in the distance, his coat a glossy black that shimmered in the sunlight. He raised his head as if sensing their presence, his ears swiveling toward them. He's beautiful, Peter said, genuinely impressed. Christina huffed. A horse is a horse. Emily shot her a sharp look but said nothing. Instead, she whistled sharply and Shadow began trotting toward them. His gait was smooth, almost elegant, and as he approached, his intelligent eyes seemed to study the group. He's smarter than most people give him credit for, Emily said, stroking Shadow's neck as he stopped beside her. He knows this land better than anyone. Peter reached out cautiously, and Shadow allowed him to stroke his muzzle. Hey buddy, Peter said softly. You're something else, huh? Shadow snorted, nudging Peter's hand as if in agreement. Christina, meanwhile, kept her distance. Let's be clear, she said, crossing her arms. We're not staying here. We're just figuring out how much this place is worth, selling it and going back to our lives. Emily arched a brow. And what does Shadow think about that? Christina scoffed. He's a horse. He doesn't get a say. Shadow tossed his head, almost as if he understood and disagreed. Peter laughed. I don't know, Chris. He seems pretty opinionated to me. The tension thickened as Christina shot her brother a glare. "This isn't a joke, Peter. We're not farmers. We're not horse people. We don't belong here. And yet your mother thought you did," Emily interjected. "Maybe you should think about why." Christina turned on her heel and headed back toward the house, muttering under her breath. Peter stayed behind, watching as Shadow followed Emily back toward the barn. "Sorry about her," he said to Emily. "She's just like that." "I noticed," Emily replied dryly. "You'd better figure out what you're doing here soon. This place doesn't have time for you two to play tourist." Peter nodded, feeling a strange mix of guilt and curiosity. Shadow stood by the barn door, watching him intently, and Peter couldn't shake the feeling that the horse was waiting for something. The farmhouse creaked with age, each groan of its wooden floorboards punctuating Christina's frustrated footsteps. She paced the living room, her sharp heels clicking against the floor, as Peter leaned casually against the doorway, sipping from a chipped coffee mug. "Peter, we need to get out of here," Christina snapped, her irritation bubbling over. "This place is falling apart. It's not worth our time." Peter smirked, unfazed. "Sure, because running away has worked so well for us so far." Christina shot him a glare, but before she could retort, a loud thud echoed from the attic above. Both siblings froze. "What was that?" Christina whispered, her voice betraying a flicker of unease. Peter set down his mug and straightened up. "No idea. Let's find out." "I'm not going up there," Christina declared. "Fine, stay here and guard the dust mites," Peter quipped, heading toward the narrow staircase. The attic was dimly lit, the only light filtering through a small, dusty window. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, their labels faded with age. As Peter moved toward the source of the noise, he noticed a heavy trunk partially hidden beneath a moth-eaten quilt. With some effort he pulled it free and opened it. Inside were stacks of papers, old photographs, and a worn leather-bound journal. Peter flipped through the first few pages, his brow furrowing as he read the familiar scrawl of their father's handwriting. "Christina," he called, his voice echoing down the staircase. "You might want to see this." Christina appeared moments later, her reluctance overshadowed by curiosity. "What is it?" Peter handed her the journal. "Dad's." Christina's fingers brushed over the cracked leather cover before she opened it. The entries began innocuously enough, notes about weather patterns, crop rotations, and livestock care, but as she read on, the tone shifted. "There's more to this land than meets the eye," Christina read aloud. "The mine holds secrets I've yet to fully uncover, secrets that could change everything for our family." "A mine?" Peter echoed, leaning closer to read over her shoulder. Christina turned another page, revealing a rough sketch of the farm's layout. A section near the back pasture was marked with an X. Beside it, their father had written, "Only for the right hands." Peter stared at the map, a spark of intrigue lighting his eyes. "What do you think he meant?" "I don't know," Christina admitted, her voice quieter now. "But whatever it was important enough to keep hidden." Later that afternoon, Peter wandered out to the pasture, the journal's map tucked under his arm. Shadow stood near the fence, his ears swiveling as Peter approached. "What do you know, huh?" Peter muttered, stroking the horse's neck. Shadow nickered softly, then began to walk toward the far end of the pasture, glancing back as if beckoning Peter to follow. Peter hesitated but eventually trailed behind the horse. Shadow led him through a cluster of trees to a clearing near the property's edge. There, half hidden beneath a tangle of weeds, was the faint outline of an old wooden door embedded in the ground. "Well, that's not ominous at all," Peter said, crouching to examine it. The door was padlocked, but the rusted chain looked fragile enough to break with the right tools. As Peter inspected the door, Emily's voice rang out behind him. "What are you doing?" Peter jumped, spinning around to face her. "You scared the hell out of me." Emily ignored him, her gaze fixed on the hidden door. "You found it," she said, her tone more serious than he'd ever heard. "I was wondering when you would." "What do you mean?" Peter asked, standing. "You knew about this?" Emily crossed her arms. "I knew it was here. Your mother mentioned it once. She said it wasn't ready to be opened." Peter frowned. "Not ready? What does that even mean?" Emily shook her head. "I don't know. But she made me promise to keep an eye on it." Peter glanced back at the door, his curiosity growing. "Well, whatever's down there, it sounds like my dad thought it was important." "Maybe," Emily said. "But Margaret also told me to warn you. This place has a way of revealing things you're not prepared for." Peter's mouth quirked into a grin. "That sounds like something out of a horror movie." Emily didn't smile. "It's not a joke, Peter. Be careful." Back at the farmhouse, Christina sat on the porch with the journal, her expression a mixture of skepticism and intrigue. The entries hinted at something grand, but the lack of specifics left her frustrated. "What's the point of all this?" she muttered. "If Dad knew about something valuable, why didn't he do anything with it?" Peter joined her, dropping into the chair beside hers. "Maybe it wasn't about value. Maybe it was about something else." Christina arched a brow. "Like what?" "I don't know yet," Peter admitted. "But I found something." He told her about the hidden door, watching her expression shift from disbelief to reluctant interest. "Of course there's a secret door," she said, rolling her eyes. "This whole thing is starting to feel like one of those ridiculous mystery novels." "Yeah, well, ridiculous or not, it's there," Peter said. "And I think we need to figure out what's behind it." Christina hesitated, glancing back at the journal in her lap. The words on the page seemed to taunt her, daring her to dig deeper. "Fine," she said finally. "But if this turns out to be nothing, we're selling this place and never looking back." Peter grinned. "Deal?" The early morning air was crisp and alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and birdsong. Peter stood at the edge of the pasture, watching Shadow graze near the fence. The horse moved with an elegance that seemed almost deliberate, his black coat gleaming in the sunlight. There was something about him, something Peter couldn't quite put his finger on. Shadow's ears perked up as Peter approached. The horse lifted his head, fixing Peter with a gaze that felt oddly knowing. "Morning, buddy," Peter said, offering an apple he'd grabbed from the kitchen. Shadow stepped forward, his movements measured, and gently took the apple from Peter's hand. As he chewed, his eyes stayed locked on Peter's as if expecting something. Peter chuckled. "What's with you, huh? You act like you've got secrets." Shadow snorted, tossing his head. Without warning, the horse turned and began walking toward the woods at the edge of the property. Peter watched, curious as Shadow stopped to look back at him. "You want me to follow?" Peter asked. Shadow nickered softly, his tail flicking as if in reply. Peter hesitated but eventually fell into step behind the horse. Shadow led him along a narrow trail that wound through the trees, stopping periodically to wait for Peter to catch up. The path was overgrown, the ground uneven with roots and rocks, but Shadow navigated it effortlessly. When they reached a small clearing, Peter froze. In the center of the space, partially buried beneath years of leaves and debris, was an old wooden post. The remains of what looked like a hand-carved horse's head were mounted on top, weathered by time but still distinct. Peter crouched to examine it. "What is this?" he muttered. Shadow stood beside him, his warm breath puffing against Peter's shoulder. The horse nudged him gently, almost urging him to look closer. Back at the farmhouse, Peter recounted the strange discovery to Christina, who sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in hand. Her expression remained skeptical. "So, let me get this straight," she said. "The horse led you to a stick in the middle of the woods?" "It wasn't just a stick," Peter insisted. "It was a marker or something. Like it meant something to Dad or Mom." Christina sighed. "Peter, you're reading way too much into this. It's a horse. He probably just wanted to stretch his legs." Peter shook his head. "You didn't see him, Chris. He knew where he was going." Before Christina could respond, Emily entered the room, carrying a basket of eggs from the coop. She glanced between the siblings, her brow furrowed. "What's going on?" "Your magical horse led my brother on a treasure hunt," Christina said dryly. Peter ignored her. "Emily, do you know anything about a wooden post out in the woods? It had a carved horse head on it." Emily's expression tightened and she set the basket down. "I've seen it," she admitted. "It's been there for as long as I can remember." "And?" Peter pressed. "What does it mean?" Emily hesitated, her gaze shifting to Shadow, who was visible through the kitchen window. The horse stood near the fence, his head low as if listening. "It was one of Margaret's markers," Emily said finally. "She used them to mark important places on the property. But she never told me why that one was special." Peter leaned forward. "Do you think it has something to do with the mine?" Emily shook her head. "I don't know. Your mother kept a lot to herself. All I know is that Shadow always seemed drawn to that spot. I used to find him there when he escaped the pasture." Christina crossed her arms. "Great. So the horse has secrets too. This just keeps getting better." Peter frowned. "Why didn't you tell us any of this before?" "Because it didn't seem important," Emily snapped. "And honestly, I didn't think you'd care." The tension in the room thickened as the siblings exchanged a glance. Christina's skepticism was clear, but Peter's curiosity burned brighter than ever. Later that day, Peter returned to the clearing with a spade, determined to uncover whatever secrets lay beneath the marker. Shadow followed him, staying close as Peter dug through the soil around the wooden post. After an hour of work, Peter's spade struck something solid. He knelt down, brushing away dirt to reveal a small metal box, rusted and worn. His heart raced as he pried it open. Inside was a bundle of faded documents tied with twine. Peter carefully unfolded the first page, his breath catching as he recognized his father's handwriting. To those who find this, know that this land carries more than gold, it carries the weight of choices made in love and desperation. Treat its secrets with care. Peter sat back, his mind racing. Shadow nudged him gently as if to say, keep going. That evening, Peter brought the box back to the farmhouse, where Christina and Emily waited. He laid the documents on the kitchen table, the three of them poring over each page. The documents included maps, letters, and contracts, all tied to the farm and the mine. Some referenced Margaret's plans for a foundation, while others hinted at partnerships Edward had formed years ago, partnerships that seemed both lucrative and fraught with tension. This is insane, Christina murmured, running her fingers over the fragile pages. Why didn't Dad tell us about any of this? Maybe he thought we wouldn't understand, Peter said. Or maybe he was waiting for the right time. Emily, who had been silent, finally spoke. Margaret always said this place would test people. That it would only reveal its truth to those who earned it. Christina rolled her eyes. Right, because that doesn't sound cryptic at all. Believe what you want, Emily said, standing. But Shadow led you to this for a reason. Maybe you should start listening. Peter looked out the window at the horse, who stood quietly in the yard, his eyes fixed on the farmhouse as if watching over them. For the first time, Peter felt a deep sense of connection, to the land, to Shadow, and to the legacy his parents had left behind. He wasn't sure what the next step was, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't giving up. The overcast sky cast a muted light over the farm as Peter and Christina followed Shadow across the property. The horse moved with purpose, his hooves crunching over the uneven terrain, leading them to the farthest edge of the land. Christina trailed behind reluctantly, muttering complaints under her breath. This is ridiculous, she said, swiping at a low-hanging branch. We're following a horse to find a mine? What's next? Does he start giving us stock tips? Just keep up, Peter called over his shoulder. His excitement only seemed to grow with each step Shadow took. Shadow paused at a cluster of thick bushes, snorting as if to get their attention. Peter crouched, pushing aside the dense foliage to reveal a weathered wooden beam partially buried in the earth. The faint outline of a doorway was visible, its edges overgrown with moss and ivy. This has to be it, Peter said, brushing dirt from the beam. Christina folded her arms, unimpressed. Congratulations. You found an old door. Ignoring her, Peter tugged at the handle. The wood groaned but held firm, resisting his efforts. Help me with this, he said, glancing up at his sister. Christina sighed but stepped forward, grabbing the other side. Together, they pulled until the door finally gave way, revealing a dark tunnel that sloped downward. A musty, metallic smell wafted out, thick with the scent of damp earth. Great, Christina muttered. A creepy mine. This just keeps getting better. Peter turned on the flashlight he brought, the beam cutting through the gloom. Come on, he said, stepping inside. Let's see what's down there. The air grew cooler as they descended, their footsteps echoing against the stone walls. Christina stayed close, her earlier skepticism giving way to a growing unease. After several minutes, the tunnel widened into a cavern. Peter's flashlight illuminated stacks of wooden crates, old mining tools, and glimmers of something unmistakable embedded in the rock walls. Is that gold? Christina asked, her voice hushed. Peter nodded, his eyes wide. Looks like it. He approached one of the crates, prying it open with a crowbar he'd found near the entrance. Inside were neatly stacked documents, their edges yellowed with age. Peter picked up the topmost folder, his heart pounding as he saw his father's name on the cover. It's all here, he said, flipping through the papers. Contracts, maps, letters. Christina joined him, her initial hesitation melting into fascination. What does it say? Peter skimmed the pages, his expression shifting from excitement to confusion. It's about the mine, he said. But it's not just about gold. Dad was working with someone, a partner. These papers talk about debts, deals, even lawsuits. Christina frowned. Why didn't he ever tell us? Before Peter could answer, his flashlight fell on a bundle of letters tucked into the corner of the crate. He pulled them out, noticing the careful handwriting on each envelope. They were addressed to Emily Harper. Emily? Christina said, leaning closer. Why would Dad write to her? Peter opened the first letter, his hands trembling. The contents left him speechless. Back at the farmhouse, Emily stood by the kitchen window, her arms crossed as she watched Shadow graze in the yard. When the door burst open, she turned to see Peter and Christina storming in, their expressions a mix of anger and confusion. "Care to explain this?" Peter demanded, slamming the bundle of letters onto the table. Emily's eyes flicked to the letters, her face paling. "Where did you get those?" "In the mine," Christina said sharply. "You know, the one Shadow led us to." "What's going on, Emily? Why was our father writing to you?" Emily's shoulders stiffened. "That's none of your business." "The hell it isn't," Peter snapped. "We have a right to know." Emily hesitated, her gaze dropping to the letters. For a moment, the room was silent except for the ticking of the kitchen clock. Finally she sighed. "Fine. You want the truth? Edward Calloway was my father." Christina's jaw dropped. "What?" Emily met her gaze, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Your father and my mother were involved before he married Margaret. When I was a child, he visited us often, made sure we had everything we needed. But when I got older, he stopped coming around. He said it was to protect me." Peter sank into a chair, struggling to process the revelation. "So you've known this whole time? And you didn't say anything?" Emily's eyes flashed with anger. "What was I supposed to say? Hey, by the way, I'm your half-sister? Your father made it clear that keeping this quiet was the best thing for everyone." Christina shook her head, still reeling. "This is insane. Why didn't Mom ever tell us?" "She didn't know," Emily said softly. "Not at first. But she found out eventually. She's the one who brought me here to work on the farm. Said she wanted to make things right." Peter looked up, his voice quiet. "Did she?" Emily hesitated. "She tried. But I think she knew you two wouldn't accept me. That's why she kept me at a distance." Christina stared at the letters on the table, her mind racing. "So all of this farm, this mine, it was all some kind of redemption plan?" "Maybe," Emily said. "Or maybe she just wanted you to see that life isn't as black and white as you think." Peter leaned back, letting out a heavy sigh. "This changes everything." "Does it?" Christina shot back. "We still don't know the full story. And honestly, I'm not sure I want to." Emily's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. The room fell into an uneasy silence, the weight of the truth pressing down on all of them. Outside, Shadow lifted his head, his ears flicking toward the house. He seemed to sense the tension, his steady presence a quiet reminder of the mysteries yet to be unraveled. The farmhouse felt smaller than ever as the weight of Emily's revelation settled over them. Peter paced near the kitchen table, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Christina stood by the window, her arms crossed tightly as if holding herself together. Emily sat at the head of the table, her expression unreadable but her hands folded tightly, betraying her own tension. "Well," Christina said finally, her voice clipped. "This just keeps getting better. First, we lose our inheritance and now we find out Dad had a secret family." "Stop," Peter said, his voice sharp. "This isn't Emily's fault." Christina turned, her eyes blazing. "Isn't it? She's been sitting on this for years, Peter. Pretending to be some random caretaker while knowing she's, what? Our sister?" "Half-sister," Emily corrected quietly, though her tone carried no malice. "And I wasn't pretending. I was just doing what your mother asked." Peter stopped pacing and faced her. "Start from the beginning. All of it." Emily hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. For a moment, the only sound was the faint ticking of the wall clock. Finally she sighed and began. "My mother, Catherine, met Edward before he married Margaret. They weren't together for long, but it was enough." Emily's voice wavered slightly before she pressed on. "When I was born, he made sure we were taken care of. He paid for our house, my schooling, everything. But he couldn't be there, not really. He said it wasn't safe for me." "Safe?" Christina scoffed. "What does that even mean?" "He was afraid we'd find out?" Emily shook her head. "It wasn't just about you. Edward had business enemies, people who wouldn't have hesitated to use me or my mother to hurt him. He said keeping us a secret was the only way to protect us." Peter sank into a chair, his brow furrowed. "So what changed? Why did Mom bring you here?" "After Edward died, Margaret reached out," Emily said. "She told me she'd always known about me and wanted to make things right. She offered me the job here, said it would give me a chance to stay connected to my father's legacy." Christina's laugh was bitter. "Connected? By mucking out stalls and tending to a farm we didn't even know about?" Emily's jaw tightened, but she held her composure. "I wasn't here for you, Christina. I was here for your mother. She wanted to give you a chance to understand the family you never knew. Family? Christina's voice cracked and she looked away, her eyes glassy. This isn't a family. It's a disaster. Peter sat silently, his mind racing with memories of their father. Edward Calloway had always been larger than life to him, a man of principle, strength, and unwavering devotion to his family. But now that image was splintered, replaced by a man who had lived a double life. He loved us, Peter said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I know he did. Emily nodded. He did. But he loved my mother and me too in his own way. Christina turned, her expression hard. Well, isn't that convenient? He gets to have it both ways, us and you, while we're left to clean up the mess. It wasn't perfect, Emily said, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. But he did what he thought was best. For all of us. Best? Christina laughed bitterly. He lied to us, Emily. To all of us. How is that best? Peter stood abruptly, running a hand through his hair. Christina, stop. What's the point of blaming her? Dad made his choices. And yeah, maybe they weren't perfect, but he was trying. Trying? Christina shot back. Trying to what? Keep us all in the dark? To protect us, Peter said, his voice firm. Maybe he didn't do it perfectly, but he was human. We all are. Christina stared at him, her jaw tight. You don't get it, she said quietly. You've always idolized him. You don't see how much this changes everything. Peter opened his mouth to argue but stopped. Deep down, he knew she wasn't entirely wrong. Later that evening, Emily found herself alone in the barn, brushing Shadow's coat in slow, deliberate strokes. The horse stood still, his calm presence grounding her as she replayed the tense conversation from earlier. The barn door creaked open and Peter stepped inside. He hesitated before approaching, his hands shoved into his pockets. Hey, he said softly. Emily glanced at him, her expression guarded. Hey. Peter leaned against the stall door, watching her work. I'm sorry about earlier. Christina can be intense. She has every right to be upset, Emily said, not looking up. You both do. Peter nodded, falling silent for a moment. You know, I always thought Dad was this perfect guy. Like he could do no wrong. But now, I don't know what to think. He wasn't perfect, Emily said gently. But he wasn't a bad man, Peter. He made mistakes, but he also loved deeply. That's why he worked so hard to protect all of us. Peter frowned. You really believe that? Emily set the brush down and turned to face him. I do. And I think Margaret did too. That's why she did what she did with the will. She wanted you to see the bigger picture. The bigger picture? Peter asked, confused. Emily gestured around the barn. This place, the farm, the mine, it's all connected. It's not just about money or inheritance. It's about family. About finding a way to heal. Peter sighed, his gaze dropping to the ground. I don't know if Christina's ever going to see it that way. Maybe not, Emily admitted. But you do. And that's a start. In the farmhouse, Christina sat alone in the living room, the journal their father had left resting on her lap. She flipped through its pages, her emotions warring between anger and sorrow. The man she had spent her life trying to impress had kept an entire world hidden from her. And now that world was staring her in the face, demanding to be acknowledged. Margaret's words echoed in her mind. You've both had every opportunity in life, but what have you given back? To anyone? To each other? Christina closed the journal, a tear slipping down her cheek. She didn't have an answer. Not yet. The morning light seeped into the farmhouse, casting long shadows across the kitchen table where Christina and Peter sat, papers scattered before them. The records from the mine painted a complex picture of their father. A man who had made bold choices, endured significant failures, and sacrificed more than they had ever realized. This doesn't make sense, Christina said, her voice tight with frustration. She held up a weathered contract, its ink faded but still legible. Why would Dad partner with someone so risky? These deals, they weren't just high stakes, they were reckless. Peter leaned over to examine the document. Maybe he didn't have a choice. Some of these notes talk about debt. Big debt? Christina sighed, running a hand through her hair. But why didn't he tell us? Why not just? She broke off, her frustration giving way to a flicker of sadness. Why didn't he trust us? Peter sat back in his chair, looking at the scattered records. Maybe he thought he was protecting us. Or maybe he just didn't know how to explain it. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft snort. Both siblings turned to see Shadow standing just outside the kitchen window, his dark eyes peering in with an almost curious expression. Christina let out a dry laugh. Of course, the horse has to be part of this too. Peter grinned. Hey, give Shadow some credit. He's been leading us in the right direction so far. Christina rolled her eyes but didn't argue. There was something about Shadow, his calm, steadfast presence, that made her feel slightly less adrift in the chaos of recent revelations. Later that day, the siblings returned to the mine, determined to uncover more of their father's story. Shadow followed them to the entrance, standing guard as they descended into the cavern. The air was cool and damp, and the faint scent of earth and metal lingered. Christina and Peter worked methodically, sifting through crates of documents, each new discovery adding another layer to their understanding of Edward Calloway. Look at this, Peter said, holding up a ledger. Dad was using the mine's profits to fund something called the Calloway Initiative. Christina leaned closer, reading over his shoulder. It's a fund for families struggling with debt. He was paying off mortgages, medical bills, even tuition. Peter whistled softly. So he wasn't just mining gold. He was trying to give back. Christina's eyes scanned the ledger, her earlier frustration replaced by a pang of guilt. He was helping people. And we didn't even know. Peter flipped to the next page, his brow furrowing as he read. But it came at a cost. Look, he took out loans to keep the initiative going when the mine's output dropped. That's why he got tangled up with those shady partners. Christina sat back, processing the revelation. Their father had been far from perfect, but his intentions had been noble. The man they had once idolized, or in Christina's case resented, was now a complex figure, flawed but deeply human. As the afternoon wore on, they unearthed more personal items. Among them was a small box containing photographs and letters. One photograph in particular caught Christina's eye. It showed Edward standing between a younger Margaret and a woman Christina didn't recognize, Emily's mother, Catherine. Shadow stood in the background, his dark coat unmistakable even in the faded image. Shadow's been here through all of it, Christina said softly, almost to herself. He was part of their lives. Of Dad's life. Peter looked over her shoulder, his expression thoughtful. Maybe that's why Mom left him to us. He's more than just a horse, he's part of the story. Christina glanced at Shadow, visible through the mine's entrance, standing silently as if keeping watch. For the first time, she felt a strange sense of gratitude toward the animal who had seemed so out of place in her life. Back at the farmhouse, Emily was waiting for them on the porch. Her posture was tense, and her expression was wary as the siblings approached. Find anything interesting? She asked, her tone neutral. Peter nodded. A lot, actually. Dad was complicated. Sounds about right, Emily said. She hesitated, then added, Look, I know you're still processing all of this, but I want to make one thing clear. I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't want to disrupt your lives. You think this is just about our lives? Christina shot back, her temper flaring. You've been living in the middle of it, knowing things we didn't, and just, what? Keeping it to yourself? Emily's jaw tightened, but she held her ground. I was following your mother's wishes. She wanted you to find out in your own time. Peter stepped between them, his voice calm. Enough. This isn't helping. Christina looked away, muttering something under her breath. Emily turned to leave but paused. For what it's worth, she said softly, I think your father would be proud of how you've handled this. Both of you. She walked away, leaving Christina and Peter standing in awkward silence. That evening, Peter found Christina sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the horizon. He handed her a mug of tea and sat beside her. You know, he said after a moment, it's okay to be angry. At Dad, at Emily, at all of it. Christina didn't respond right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. I just don't know who he was anymore. I thought I did, but now. Peter nodded. I get it. But maybe we don't have to figure it all out right now. Maybe it's enough to just try. Christina glanced at him, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. Since when are you the wise one? Since you started acting like a grumpy old lady, Peter teased, earning a soft laugh. For the first time in days, the tension between them eased. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the farm in golden light, Shadow stood in the distance, his silhouette a quiet reminder of the unity Margaret had envisioned for her fractured family. The air was thick with the threat of an impending storm as Christina stood in the barn, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Emily was on the other side of the room, packing supplies into a crate. The tension between them was as palpable as the humidity in the air. We need to make this work, Peter said from the barn doorway, looking between the two women. I don't care what's happened before. If we don't figure this out, we're going to lose everything Dad and Mom worked for. Christina shot him a sharp glance. That's easy for you to say. You're not the one expected to trust someone who's been lying to us for years. Emily set down the crate with a thud, her eyes narrowing. I didn't lie to you, Christina. I told you the truth as soon as it mattered. I've been here working to keep this farm going while you've been— Where exactly? Christina's jaw tightened. I was building a life, one that didn't involve digging through secrets or chasing after a horse like he's Lassie. That horse has done more for this family than you have, Emily retorted, her voice rising. Enough. Peter snapped, stepping between them. This isn't about you two fighting. It's about making sure we don't lose what we've got left. Before either woman could respond, a sudden clap of thunder shook the barn, followed by a panicked whinny from Shadow. The horse, startled by the storm, bolted out of the pasture, his dark figure disappearing into the woods. Shadow? Peter shouted, running after him. Emily didn't hesitate, grabbing a halter and rope from a nearby hook. I'll go with him. He'll need help. Christina hesitated but then grabbed a flashlight. I'm coming too. The woods were dark and foreboding as the three of them searched for Shadow. The storm had turned the dirt paths into muddy trails, and the sound of the wind masked any trace of the horse's movements. Shadow? Peter called, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. Christina shivered as another crack of thunder rolled through the sky. He's probably long gone. This is pointless. He's not gone, Emily said firmly, shining her flashlight into the dense undergrowth. Shadow always comes back. He just needs a little help. Peter stopped suddenly, pointing ahead. There. I think I see him. Through the trees, Shadow stood near the edge of a ravine, his black coat glistening in the rain. His posture was tense, his hooves shifting nervously near the unstable ground. Careful, Emily warned as they approached. The ground might give way. Peter crouched, holding out his hand. Easy, Shadow. We're here. The horse's ears flicked toward him, but he didn't move. Emily inched closer, speaking softly. You're okay, boy. We'll get you home. Christina, standing back, watched with growing anxiety. As Emily reached for Shadow's halter, a section of the ground crumbled beneath her feet. She stumbled, her hand grabbing at Shadow's neck for balance. Emily? Christina cried, rushing forward. Without thinking, she grabbed Emily's arm, pulling her back onto solid ground. Together, they stumbled away from the edge, both breathing heavily. Shadow, seemingly unfazed, stepped back toward the two women, nuzzling Emily's shoulder. You okay? Christina asked, her voice softer than before. Emily nodded, her expression a mix of surprise and gratitude. Yeah, thanks. Peter exhaled in relief. Let's get him back before this storm gets worse. Back at the barn, the tension had eased. Shadow stood calmly in his stall, munching on hay as if nothing had happened. Christina and Emily worked side by side, drying his coat and checking him for injuries. You handled that well, Christina admitted reluctantly, glancing at Emily. I mean the whole, not panicking thing. Emily shrugged. Shadow's been through worse. So have I. Christina hesitated, then sighed. Look, I'm not good at this emotional stuff. But maybe I've been too hard on you. Emily met her gaze, her expression cautious but open. And maybe I could have handled things differently too. Peter watched from the doorway, a small smile tugging at his lips. Look at that, progress. Christina rolled her eyes but didn't argue. For the first time, it felt like they were on the same side. The next morning, as the storm cleared, Peter joined Christina and Emily at the kitchen table. A stack of papers lay between them, maps, contracts, and letters they'd pulled from the mine. I've been thinking, Peter said, his tone serious. We can't just sell this place. It's not what Dad or Mom would have wanted. Then what do we do? Christina asked, her skepticism tempered by curiosity. Peter glanced at Emily, then back at his sister. We use it. The mine's profits, the land, it could all go toward something bigger. Like what Dad was doing with the Callaway Initiative. You mean paying off people's debts? Christina asked. Not just that, Emily interjected. We could expand it. Build something lasting, something that helps people in real ways. Christina leaned back in her chair, considering the idea. A foundation. For education, housing, whatever people need. Peter nodded. Exactly. For the first time in days, a sense of purpose filled the room. The three of them began sketching out plans, their differences momentarily set aside as they worked toward a shared goal. Shadow watched from the pasture, his dark eyes calm and steady. He had been there through every step of their journey, a quiet reminder of the resilience and unity Margaret had envisioned. And now, for the first time, her dream seemed within reach. The morning sun filtered through the farmhouse windows, casting a warm glow over the kitchen table, which was now piled high with maps, documents, and ledgers. Peter, Christina, and Emily were deep in discussion when Peter suddenly noticed a sealed envelope tucked beneath a stack of papers. "What's this?" he asked, pulling it out. Emily leaned over to look. "It's addressed to you and Christina." Peter carefully opened the envelope, his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded the letter inside. Margaret's elegant handwriting filled the page, each word deliberate and precise. "My dearest Christina and Peter, if you are reading this, it means you've begun to uncover the truths hidden within this farm and the mine. I know this journey has not been easy for you, and for that, I am both sorry and hopeful. My intentions were never to hurt you but to guide you towards something greater than yourselves. When your father and I built our life together, we dreamed of creating more than just wealth. We dreamed of creating a legacy of kindness and opportunity. What you may not know is that my childhood was far from easy. I grew up with little, and what I did have was thanks to the generosity of strangers who believed in helping those who couldn't help themselves. That belief stayed with me, and when Edward and I discovered the potential of this mine, we made a promise. Its fortune would not just enrich our family but also the lives of others. Over the years, Edward used much of the mine's wealth to quietly support families, students, and those who had nowhere else to turn. The Callaway Initiative was only the beginning. But this work cannot end with us. It must continue with you. The Callaway Foundation is my dream. A place where children without homes can find shelter, where students without resources can find support, and where struggling families can find a second chance. It's a dream I hope you'll make your own. Shadow has been a quiet guardian of this land and its secrets, but now it is your turn to lead. This farm, this mine, and all its potential are yours to shape. I trust you will make the right choice. With all my love, Mom." By the time Peter finished reading, the room was silent. Christina stared at the letter, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Even Emily, who had always seemed so composed, looked deeply moved. "She never told us," Christina said softly, "about her childhood, about any of this. She wanted us to figure it out on our own," Peter said. "To prove we could handle it." Emily cleared her throat, her voice quiet but steady. "And to make sure you understood why it matters." Christina looked up at her, the animosity she'd carried for days finally softening. "You knew, didn't you?" "Not all of it," Emily admitted. "But I knew Margaret wanted to leave behind something bigger than money. She talked about it sometimes, especially after Edward passed." Peter leaned forward, his voice filled with determination. "We have to do this. We have to build the foundation." Christina nodded slowly. "Mom's right. This is more than just a farm or a mine. It's a chance to make a difference." Emily smiled faintly. "Then let's get started." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. The trio worked tirelessly, sorting through the mine's records to determine how much of its wealth could be allocated toward Margaret's vision. Emily contacted local organizations for guidance, while Christina began drafting the initial framework for the Callaway Foundation. Peter took on the task of overseeing repairs to the farmhouse and the mine, enlisting local workers to help bring the property back to life. Shadow was ever present, watching their efforts with his usual calm demeanor, as if silently approving. In the evenings, the three of them gathered around the kitchen table, sharing ideas and piecing together their plan. Slowly but surely, the animosity and distrust that had once divided them gave way to camaraderie and mutual respect. One afternoon, Christina stood by the pasture, watching Shadow graze under the shade of an old oak tree. Emily approached, her steps quiet but purposeful. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Emily asked, stopping beside her. Christina smiled faintly. "Just thinking about Mom. She always seemed so composed, like nothing could shake her. But now I realize how much she carried. Her past, her dreams, she was so much stronger than I ever gave her credit for." "She believed in you," Emily said. "Both of you. Even when you didn't see it." Christina glanced at her, a trace of guilt in her expression. "I haven't exactly made this easy for you. For any of us." Emily shrugged. "Neither have I. But we're getting there." For the first time, Christina extended her hand. Emily hesitated briefly before taking it, the simple gesture marking a quiet truce between them. By the end of the week, the Callaway Foundation had begun to take shape. Christina drafted the mission statement, Peter secured the necessary permits for the mine's continued operation, and Emily established connections with local communities to identify those in need. Shadow's presence became a symbol of their efforts, a reminder of Margaret's unwavering belief in unity and humility. The horse, who had once seemed like an odd and unnecessary inheritance, now felt like the heart of the farm and its future. As they stood together on the farmhouse porch, watching the sun set over the fields, Peter broke the silence. "You think Mom would be proud?" Christina smiled. "I think she already was." Emily nodded, her gaze on the horizon. "And now it's our turn to make sure her dream lives on." The three of them stood side by side, their differences no longer dividing them but strengthening their resolve. Margaret's legacy had become their own, and together they were ready to carry it forward. The Callaway Foundation became more than just an idea. It became a reality. Over the following months, the farmhouse transformed from a relic of the past into the heartbeat of a movement dedicated to compassion and opportunity. Christina, Peter, and Emily each found their role in bringing Margaret's dream to life, their once divided lives now intertwined by a shared purpose. Peter was in the barn, hammering the last nail into a freshly built fence as Shadow stood nearby, watching him intently. The horse's calm presence had become a source of comfort for Peter, who often found himself reflecting on how much had changed. "There," Peter said, stepping back to admire his work. "Looks good, huh?" Shadow nickered softly, his tail swishing as if in agreement. Emily appeared, carrying a clipboard and a stack of papers. The contractors finished clearing out the mine entrance. "We'll have full access by the end of the week." Peter wiped his hands on his jeans. "Perfect. That'll give us enough time to start moving supplies." Emily nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It's strange, isn't it? How everything seems so overwhelming at first. And now? Now it feels like we're exactly where we're supposed to be," Peter finished. Emily smiled, and for a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, Shadow grazing between them. Inside the farmhouse, Christina sat at the kitchen table, poring over financial reports. The once cluttered space had been transformed into an impromptu office, complete with whiteboards detailing the foundation's goals. Her phone buzzed and she answered with a curt but polite tone. "Callaway Foundation, Christina speaking." "Yes, we'd be happy to partner with your organization. Let's schedule a meeting next week." When she hung up, Christina leaned back in her chair, letting out a small sigh of satisfaction. She had spent years climbing the corporate ladder, chasing recognition and success. But now, for the first time, she felt like her work truly mattered. Peter and Emily entered, carrying updates and proposals. The three of them sat together, discussing the foundation's progress and its future. Their conversations were no longer marked by tension or competition but by mutual respect and collaboration. "We're making real progress," Christina said, her voice carrying a hint of pride. "The first scholarships are already being awarded, and the shelter renovation is ahead of schedule." "It's not just progress," Peter added. "It's a legacy." Emily glanced out the window where Shadow stood under the oak tree. "And it's just the beginning." The foundation's opening ceremony was held on the farm, a celebration of Margaret's vision brought to life. Guests from the local community, families who had already benefited from the foundation, and even a few of Edward's old business partners gathered to honor the Callaway family's efforts. Christina took the stage first, her usual confidence tempered by genuine emotion. "This farm was always more than just land," she began. "It was a place of hope, built by two people who believed in something bigger than themselves. My mother and father taught us that true wealth isn't measured in gold but in the lives we touch." Peter followed, sharing stories of Edward's quiet generosity and Margaret's unwavering strength. Emily spoke last, her voice steady as she shared her journey of finding a place within the Callaway legacy. The audience applauded as the three of them unveiled a plaque commemorating Margaret and Edward, the inscription reading, "In loving memory of those who dreamed beyond themselves." As the sun set and the guests began to leave, the siblings and Emily stood together by the pasture. Shadow approached, nudging Peter gently before turning to Christina, who tentatively reached out to stroke his neck. "I never thought I'd say this," Christina admitted, "but I think I understand why Mom left him to us." Peter grinned. "Told you he was special?" Emily laughed softly. "He's not just a horse. He's part of this place. Part of us." They stood in silence for a moment, watching as Shadow moved back toward the oak tree, his dark figure silhouetted against the fading light. That night, as they gathered around the fireplace, Christina raised a glass. "To Mom," she said. "For believing in us even when we didn't believe in each other." "To Dad," Peter added. "For teaching us that mistakes don't define us, our choices do." Emily smiled, lifting her glass. "And to Margaret's dream, which we'll keep alive together." As their glasses clinked, a sense of peace settled over the room. The Callaway family, fractured for so long, had finally come together, not just to honor the past but to build a future that would carry their parents' legacy forward. Outside, Shadow stood under the starlit sky, his head held high as though he, too, was keeping watch over the farm and the family it had reunited. Margaret Calloway's bold decision to change her will set her children on a journey of self-discovery, family reconciliation, and a greater purpose. If you were in Christina or Peter's shoes, how would you have reacted to such a shocking turn of events? Do you think you could have embraced Margaret's vision, or would resentment have clouded your judgment? What would you have done differently in their place? If this heartfelt story of family, redemption, and building a meaningful legacy resonated with you, let us know. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of the journey touched you the most? Did you agree with the choices the siblings made, or do you feel there was another path they could have taken? And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more moving narratives.